All right, so next let's look into the manifest app. Now in this case, we won't be dragging and dropping and uploading any files. We'll have some files already in an external DMS, and we just have to connect the DMS with our application. So once again, we'll be using this Azure Blob Storage, and here are two files that we need to connect to the app. How do we do that? So the manifest sample has two parts to it. There's the portal side, which is the front-end code, and then there's external storage drive. Now this is actually some backend code that we need to use to access our DMS. And you can use this code as an example to connect to your own cloud-based DMS. And what this is it's a pretty straightforward service that supports two types of DMSs, Azure Blob Storage and Microsoft SharePoint. You can configure which DMS you want to use in the environment. You can find more information on that in the README. And in terms of files, what we have is two main files, external access and external storage. External access gives us an access token or an access URL to the DMS that we want to use. In this case, we have samples for SharePoint and also Azure Blob Storage. So these are the two examples, and you can see this just returns the URL or the token to give us access to the service. Once we have access, external storage is what allows us to actually get a list of all the files in that DMS and generate ID. So for example, this is Azure Blob Storage. In this case, we generate IDs just the way we did in our example in the last chapter. We're using a URL to generate the ID. And then we also provide the download URL, which is the SAS URL in this case. And we return this array of information for all the files. Same thing in SharePoint. We access all the files. In this case, SharePoint does already provide IDs for its files. So you can see that in this case, we just pass in the item ID that we get back from our response. And of course, there's a download URL as well. So you can see that the format of both these arrays is the same. Now, if we go under index.ts, we'll see exactly how these functions are served out. So we have one method here, get external storage files. This is hosted in port 3001 right now locally. And this allows us to get all the storage files that are stored in the DMS. And it can be either Azure or SharePoint, depending on the environment configuration. And it just returns that information. And how do we access this from the front end? So for that, we have our hooks. Once again, there's this use external API hook. And that, again, uses the same method, get external storage files. Fetches the file information, and then we get the JSON from the response object and return our external files. This gives us a way for file identification, and we are ready to actually use the Synchronization API. Once again, it's going to be the three-step of creating a connection, running the connection, and getting the run status. So for that, there's a use manifest API hook, and that has these methods: create manifest connection, run manifest connection, and get manifest connection run results. Now, one thing to note is that in this case, we're not using OpenAPI. This is to demonstrate another approach you can use to interact with the API. We're just using basic post. So this is just basic HTTP fetch, and we're calling it on the API URL and sending in our body as JSON and the request headers as well. So this has the three commands of creating the connection, running the connection, and you can see in the run connection, we expect the external files, the data to come in, the same exact data that we saw just now from external storage file, and we are able to parse it to fulfill our requirement for all the run details. Now, if you remember, that is the most complicated part of using the manifest API, is to create a manifest connection run, and we're able to fill out all these details using the response we get back from our external storage drive. And then, of course, we can get the manifest connection run results. In this case, we pass in the actual location of the run, the URL for the run, and we simply do a basic get. Now, what is this run location? Now, if you don't remember, once we actually create the run, we get back a URL for a response. So we can look at that here, the response URL. It returns the location, the URL of the actual run. And we can simply go to that URL to get the run status. Okay, so one more class I want to talk about is this wrapper class under services, synchronization service. This wraps around some of the methods from the use manifest API and makes it easier to execute some of the application logic. So for example, when we run the manifest connection, we take in a connection definition ID and external files that we're getting from external storage drive. What this allows us to do is we get all the manifest connection source files that are already defined in the manifest connection. We can get all their IDs, and then we can run the manifest connection definition, pass in these source files along with the external files. Now, what does this mean? When we run the manifest connection, we need to make sure that the ID that we pass in matches the actual ID that we have for the file. And we need to be very careful with these IDs and make sure that we're putting the right ID with the right file, so there's no duplicate data and the synchronization can process the files correctly. That's what's happening here is when we get the manifest connection source files, we're getting the IDs that are already stored in the connection, and then we can pass these in the run command to double check, verify, and match them with the external files so we can put the right file with the right ID. And that's pretty much it. Now, where do these hooks actually meet up with the UI? So if you go back to app.tsx synchronization page, that's the entry point into the UI. We go to the definition, and you will see that this class in itself, it presents a table that we see in the app demo, this one right here, that has a list of all the files coming in from the DMS and also the files that are synchronized into the IAM model. And this file handles pretty much all that logic, and it uses both the external storage, the external API hook, and also the synchronization service that we just looked at, which encapsulates the use external API hook. And that's pretty much it. That's how all the pieces tie together. And once again, I encourage you to look into this repo in more detail. But this is just a basic walkthrough to show you where exactly all the parts are and how it interacts with the API and the external DMS. At this point, we are ready to wrap the course up. Now in the next and last video of the course, let's check out how you can make the most of the synchronization API and all the concepts we discussed in this course.